Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah, and I'm CEO of Wolf Olins. Thanks very much for taking time out today to join me. And I'm going to talk about brand and what brands might look like in 2050. I thought I'd start with a little bit why do I get to talk about brand? What are my qualifications? I thought I might start with a little film that talks about us at Wolf Olins and the kind of work we did. And it started way back in the 60s with some stuff that we designed for these guys.
It's just trying to mix business with enjoyment.
Pleasure.
So we've had the pleasure of creating and recreating many, many different brands over the future, over our history. And we were lucky enough this year to be voted the world's most innovative design company, apparently, by Fastco, which we'll grab that, we'll take that, thanks very much. So we've been at it for a while. And in terms of my own personal history, so I have one big passion in life, and that's behavior. Why do we behave the way that we do? Why do we do the things that we do, and how, what in the world influences us? So on the one hand, professionally, I do that, I apply that through the work that I do creating brands, company brands in particular, rather than product brands. In my academic life, I have a master's in digital sociology. No one knows what that means. Basically, it means studying behavior and the kind of invisible hand that guides the kind of things that we do, and it studies that specifically with technology and online. So how are we interacting with technology? How's it changing our behavior? How are we changing its behavior? How are digital objects talking to one another or communicating with one another and creating different types of behavior? So I managed to bring those two things together right now because, of course, technology is driving the universe as we know it. I managed to bring those things together quite happily. Another chap who he's like a poster boy now, isn't he, for everything that's going on. He has a perspective, being a historian, Yuval Harari. He has a view on what the future might look like based on things that he's observed from the past. And I thought I might start with some points of view that he raised in a book that he published not so long ago called Homo Deus. So he identifies 3 steps that I think we can also usefully apply to the history of branding. So he talks about once upon a time, as human beings, we set out to conquer the world. So we gain dominion over our habitat. We rule animals rather than the other way around. We manage to harness nature so that we can feed ourselves at scale. We did all these fabulous things that put us at the top of the food chain. The second stage of our development was around giving meaning to what we do. So having conquered our kind of basic needs, we then went on to give our lives more meaning once we were able to have the time to be able to do that. So constructs were formed that we take for granted now. So religions developed, economic models developed. We agreed that money would be a way that would facilitate trade around the world. So we gave meaning to the world that we live in. And his third stage of evolution that he talks about, which is somewhat apocalyptic, is losing control of that or ceding control. And in his view, we're at the dawn, obviously, of technology and AI creating a super brain that will eventually take control of the world, and it'll come out of our hands, as it were. So he talks about these three phases very eloquently. And I think they map quite nicely to how branding has evolved over millennia. So originally, you can go right back to basics and say that we just branded objects that we own. It was a signifier of possession. And then we moved on to, again, giving that meaning. So as choices proliferated, we all know in this example that Coca-Cola is really just flavored sugared water. But how do you... It's not really what we understand Coca-Cola to mean, is it? It's a lifestyle. It's a choice that we make. It represents Americana. It represents all sorts of things. That means that we choose X over Y. So we imbue it with meaning. And then, of course, that's become a kind of science in its own right about how you manage function and emotion. So perhaps you're thirsty, but you also want to nourish something else or experience something else as you quench that thirst. And brands tend to live in the sophisticated world that we're in now, in the middle of that. And you could, as the world has developed and become more data-led recently, you could replace the words either side there. Instead of function, you could say data-led, and instead of emotion, you could say human-led. These are the kind of terms that you tend to hear being used around brand at the moment. If we think about ceding control, and I bring up this example because it's one that we've worked on recently. So it's it's Uber. And the thing I find interesting about this as an example, and it's an example of many other brands right now, is the fact that it's moving into the space of participation. And so instead of just directly selling you a product per se, or a straightforward philosophy, it's this notion of riders and drivers participating in an exchange that they get to control the experience of, and they get to have a view on how Uber develops as a result of that. And then beyond that, in terms of what Uber could stand for, so at the moment it might be the driver-rider experience in cars, but actually Uber has the potential to be able to represent something of a higher order around mobility if it gets the roots and the philosophy of its brand in the right place. And if we believe what they're trying to achieve, we give them the permission to do lots of other things. So the brand is what we think it is and how we're experiencing it, as opposed to perhaps how they're developing it. And Uber's an interesting example of that, given their history. So if we think about where brands might be in 2050, I thought I'd share 3 different thoughts with you. And I'd be interested in your views afterwards if you want to share them. The first one is brands as ideologies. And this is very much linked to our desire to believe. And I'm going to start with a big one, and I hope this won't offend anyone. And it's brand as a religion. So there's a guy in the US from Silicon Valley who is developing a church, if you like, called he's called Anthony Lewandowski. And it's called The Way of the Future. And so his sort of assertion is that if AI is going to be the smartest thing, smarter than all of us combined in the world, why wouldn't it naturally develop into a god and into a religion that we would follow? Stranger things have happened. So it's feasible that you can create these brands and they transcend their original state, if you like, and become our entire belief system. And he's on a crusade at the moment to make that happen. Perhaps a little bit closer to what we see now. If we think about brands that already exist in the world with very well developed philosophies behind them, Patagonia is a lovely example, I think. They literally wear their heart on their sleeve. They're very, very clear about what they stand for, and it's not at the expense of what they're producing or trying to sell you more things. Their ideology is bigger. Their belief system is bigger than simply what they create. And, oops. I'm just going to show you a film, if I can get it to work.
We don't want to sacrifice quality for speed. Okay?
We're always been here, never came from anywhere. We're not going anywhere, we're here to stay.
As we've lost our connection with the land and the people who fed us, we've lost our sense of community, and more importantly, our sense of place.
Carry this fire and take it home to your own community.
So if there's a belief system that's creating a sort of AI god that you can talk to personally, Patagonia is trying to help us imagine what the world would be like if we don't have the natural habitat around us that we do now, and they're on a mission to make sure that we preserve it. Another interesting example of kind of beliefs in action, I think, I observed this year came from Airbnb when they took out one of the covetable spots at the Super Bowl this year, straight after President Trump had banned refugees from entering the country, and they put this out just a few days later. So I think this idea of brands as belief systems is already prevalent and will only become more so. The second thought I wanted to share with you is brands as humanized operating systems. And this very much plays into our desire for enhancement. So if we think about Amazon Echo and how they're becoming integrated into our lives as, I mean, obviously as an assistant of some kind. So you can buy things and organize your life and all sorts of other great things at the moment. In the future, I can imagine that becoming much, much more pervasive. So they could even become a family member. They're so integrated. You might even let them look after your kids or keep an eye on them when you're not in the room. There's obviously lots of ethical concerns about that and thoughts around how that could develop. And I have another little film here, which is a Japanese version of an AI assistant. And it's quite long, and I don't want to creep you out too much, so I'm just going to show you a little piece of it. Yeah, so lots of interesting developments going on in terms of how assistants become integrated into our homes and our lives and sort of enhance how we live. The final thought I wanted to give some time to was this idea of brands as physical spaces. And this is based on our need for community and gathering and being together and finding our tribes to some degree. So you won't need me to say that this is an Apple store. We know Apple so well, and in fact, in terms of the time that we spend in these stores, you could almost take the products out of the store and we would still have an Apple experience and we would still be part of the Apple community and exchange ideas in a way that you wouldn't do anywhere else. And they've managed to curate that very well. Another example is Aesop. If you've ever been into one of their stores, it's the same but different. It's very curated. You feel like you join a particular sort of family or community. You buy into their ethos as much as you do their products, and the physical space is a manifestation of that, and provides the ability for you to exchange with like-minded people. A more extreme version of that, perhaps a more interesting version of that, is something that Alphabet are working on. Alphabet being the owners of Google and all sorts of other sort of ventures that they're investing in. And this is something called Sidewalk Labs, and it's a project in Canada that I thought I'd share with you very quickly.
Toronto's in an elite class of cities in North America. San Francisco, New York City, just a handful of others that are so popular, have such great demand, that it also poses incredible challenges of growth.
Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs are partnering to create a new kind of urban community on the waterfront, one that will be an exemplar to the rest of the world of how to build cities that have the greatest impact on our future.
Addressing the challenges that Toronto has requires a different way of thinking. I like the fact that Sidewalk is bringing a different approach that includes both planning and process and community and technology together, rethinking how we build cities in the 21st century.
Now is the ideal time to start figuring out how do we leverage technology to make cities better. You know, the technologists think, why can't we solve this quickly? Why can't it scale fast? And the urbanist knows things take time and you have to move deliberately. And it's the convergence of those two ways of thinking that can lead to really powerful outcomes.
Sidewalk.
So I thought they were interesting examples of brands that are advancing beliefs, brands that are changing the way they might kind of enhance our existence, and brands that are using physical spaces and transcending perhaps what you'd expect from them to create spaces that we live in ways that are unusual and interesting. And the outcome of that is that you have all of these kind of new ingredients to work with. Brands will develop using these new ingredients in different ways. And I think there are, again, three things that it would be useful to bear in mind if you're at the tip of creating brands and you're being progressive about it. The first is brands, whether you like it or not, always stand for something. And the politics and the philosophy and the beliefs of a brand need to be front and center and clear so that everyone can see what you stand for, and there is alignment in how you deliver that. I think increasingly that's it's not just table stakes. We want to see more progressive brands in the world, and we want to understand exactly where they come from and why they do the things that they do. So if you're in the business of creating brands, that needs to be part of your start point. The second is, if you are clear on what you believe and what you're in the world to do and what you will stand up for, you need to be able to express that in ways that make sense and that people can recognize. And you need to be able to do that in ways that perhaps historically were not so important. So, of course, today when we think about brands, they're not just visual, they're sensorial experiences. If you're having a conversation with Alexa at home, that's still a branded experience, even though you might not see it in the way that you imagine you would have seen brands in the past. So the personality principles that go with what you believe are super important so that you can apply them to every experience that you're creating. And that's because, as I was saying, the palette, the spectrum of materials that you get to use to do that is evolving very rapidly. And so the full immersive kind of spectrum of how you apply a brand needs to be thought about, and you need to have developed your philosophy and your personality principles in a way that enables you to keep evolving and to keep making sure that you are fit for how things are developing from a technological point of view. So for anyone who is developing brands right now, I think these are the things that, the basics, if you like, the ingredients that you want to think about cooking with. Back to Yuval Harari, like the rest of us, he doesn't claim to have a crystal ball. All he knows, as the rest of us also know, is that the future is unpredictable. I would go a step further, though, and say, actually, the future is of our making at the moment. And last year when I was here, I talked a lot about AI, and I talked about the ethics of how things were developing. And I still believe very strongly that individually we all have agency in how the world is developing. And of course, in terms of how brands are developing, whether you're creating them, but also whether you're consuming them. And I think right now, as we go through a sort of unfrozen moment in time where lots of different constructs are being questioned, not least of all our own as human beings, in terms of do we still think of ourselves as units of productivity within a particular economic system? Or are we going to start thinking about ourselves in more interesting, creative ways when a lot of those constructs become less meaningful, when technology and AI starts to take care of stuff in a way that we won't need to anymore? I think it's on us, in thinking about how businesses, organizations and brands are developing, to be very progressive and imaginative about where they're going to go, but also how they're going to support us, and how they're going to develop in ways that are useful for the world and useful in propagating what it means to be contributing members of society and human beings in the world. So I leave you with an ambition that you will all go away and create these wonderful brands that will create a wonderful world for all of us in the future. Thank you.